And so I guess for me personally, like if I were to ask you anything, like I would say, like, what would you say is like one technique that you found to help you sort of get out of body, like actually in the sitting up process? Because oftentimes I'll lose it at that point if I can get past the fear hurdle. You know, a lot of times I'll be like in the at the sleep paralysis state, and I'll either try to get up, which is problematic for me because I usually move the small muscles of my abdomen to snap myself out of it, or I'll try to like project myself out, but sometimes that doesn't work if I don't have quite the confidence behind it. So I guess what would you suggest?
Well, there's a few different things that I do typically. Well, I would say probably 3 different methods that work best for me. First, so I really like Michael Raduga's different techniques. So he talks about the direct method, which is basically projecting without going to sleep, and the indirect method, which is basically projecting as soon as you wake up. And then he talks about projection through lucid dreaming, which I don't do quite as much. But if I'm using the direct method and I'm trying to project without sleeping first, usually I'll get into that void type state, you know, where your body's asleep and your mind's awake. And then I can do one of 2 things. I can either try to help the process along, and if I'm doing that, then it's usually through imagined motion. So I don't know if you've messed with imagined motion very much, but I found that it's a really powerful thing when you're in that state. So, you know, what I found is that a lot of the different projection exit techniques all have to do with imagined motion. So the rope technique, you're basically trying to feel that motion of climbing up a rope and going out of body. And the hammock technique, you're trying to feel that motion of swaying side to side. And I got this idea from a different YouTube video. There was a guy, a video on Ask a Monk about astral projection, and he talks about how he was doing this hammock technique while he was meditating. And then at one point, he started swinging his hammock like this, round in circles, and at one point, he was just ejected out of his body. And I thought, oh, I've never tried that. I've only ever tried this hammock motion back and forth. So I started picturing this forward and backwards, almost like a swing set type feeling. But that was really difficult for me to figure out how to swing upside down because I'm not familiar with that. I've never swung upside down on a swing set. But then I got to thinking about it, and I thought, well, I've been on lots of roller coasters that go in loops. And so I started practicing inducing the sensation, you know, all the vestibular sensations and the sensation in your stomach, and just this actually feeling the movement of going around and around and around. And so what I found is if I'm in that void state and I can start doing loops in my mind and I can actually induce the motion sensation, then I'll have the same sort of experience. I'll just be ejected and just shot out of my body, and I'll just land somewhere random.
Oh, that's really cool. I've never actually heard of that one before. That one,
it works really well. I was going to say, if you practice meditation at all, maybe spend some of your meditation time practicing inducing movement, and maybe listen to audio tracks that help that. So I've been experimenting with that, and I've been making audio tracks that have like a 3-dimensional sound that rotates around in circles and try to help me focus and help me basically pretend that I'm spinning in circles and trying to induce that sense of movement.
That's really cool.
And that helps when you're in that state. So then the other option when I get into that state, if I don't want to try to force that and try to just get shot out wherever I happen to land, is I actually also took from Michael Raduga. It works really well, and it's basically going through a number of, he calls it micro sleep, or I think of it as little micro blackouts, where you just let yourself dip into sleep and then pull yourself back out again just a second or two later. And every time you dip in and dip back out again, you get closer and closer to that borderline, that threshold between awake and asleep. And as soon as you just kind of flatline right on that borderline where you hear yourself snoring because your body's asleep and your mind's awake, the process just seems to evolve on its own. And you start hearing noises in your ears, and if you kind of ignore those and just let them happen, and you just continue doing whatever you did to cause those noises to start in the first place, then they'll build in frequency and vibration, and eventually I'll get to the point where I can just see my room through my sleep mask and my eyelids, and at that point I can just roll right out, and there's never any risk of me moving my physical body, because at that point it's almost always guaranteed, if I can see through my eyelids, that I'm disconnected enough where I can just roll right out and I can just move on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I think, like you were mentioning, like with the sounds, like one way I find that getting up out of body becomes easier for me is if I actually take the time to like consciously speed up and slow down the sound. Like, and I don't know how to exactly describe the movement. There's some kind of internal movement where I know that I can make it go faster and slower, and then eventually it hits a point where it's sort of like the sound stabilizes and like hits a point of equilibrium. And I find that once I hit that point, it becomes easier for me to get out of body.
For you, are the sounds like these swishing type pulsing sensations?
Yeah, it's sort of like, the way I would describe it is it's a mix between like radio fuzz and a flying saucer from a cheesy 1960s sci-fi movie. Like it's like that, those two sounds like mixed together, but they have like, it's not always an even thing. Like it's almost like the sounds that I'm hearing in both ears almost kind of like have like a shh kind of way of going. And it seems like whenever I hit that point of equilibrium, they're like the same. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, that's exactly what I experience. It's for me, it's a pulsating type radio type static sound, and the longer I let it go, usually the faster it'll go, and it'll speed up and speed up and speed up until it's just one continuous roar, and then it's really, really loud and intense and fills my whole head.
So for me personally, a lot of people will talk about the astral plane, and they'll talk about it being like this like heavenly kind of place, you know, where like you'd almost mentioned that like things were sort of iridescent at one state. And like for me, I've experienced like individual things here and there that have like an iridescence to it, but I've never been fully immersed in like a reality that was really fantastical. Most things seem like mostly like mundane life with just like maybe slight differences here and there. So have you ever experienced anything like that could be described as like the astral plane, like in the terms of it being very majestic looking?
Yeah, only once. So it's never really dark when I get out. It's everything. If it is dark in the room, everything sort of has like that iridescent glow, so I can still see everything. I've never had an experience where I just can't see anything in the room, but everything usually is very physical reality, like very Earth-like.
Yes.
I've had one experience only where I got to the void type state, and so I'm laying there and I'm just floating around in this blackness, and just kind of waiting for this process to continue on its own. And this was after I had gone to the Monroe Institute, and they talk a lot about, you know, asking for help and, you know, requesting help from your higher self or from helpers or from whoever you think that is out there that can help you. And that was something I had never done before. And so at one point I just said, kind of in my mind said, you know, if anybody's out there, I'd really like to see something new. And that led to me being dragged out of my bed by my ankles and carried through the sky and then dropped onto some completely other, it was like a completely other planet, a completely different planet, like green with lakes and things like that, but nothing touched the ground.
Oh, that's
which
interesting.
was a strange sensation. So I was dropped and I landed maybe just, you know, a foot or two above the ground, and there's all these relics and statues and all these crazy symbols and things like that, just all floating off the ground, and nothing actually ever touched the ground. And that was the only unearth-like type environment that I've ever visited. Everything else has been very much physical reality.
That's really interesting. Yeah, see, for me, it's all been pretty much like physical reality. I mean, there have been things like I can do things that are not like physical reality, like flying, or, you know, sometimes I'll see like different things that just aren't supposed to be where they're at, or I can go through doors. Like one time I actually jumped into my front door back there and everything went gray. And I had set the intention that I wanted to go to Paris. I don't know if I ended up in a place that was Paris or what, but I basically, out of the gray, there started becoming like all of these faces sort of popping out. And I realized that I was on like this pedestrian walkway, and I was like right in the face of these two teenage girls who were having a conversation on a bench. And I realized I was just like too close for comfort. So I backed up and I ended up walking off, and I ended up finding this whole other like road system with like a mountain that was behind it and a stream next to it. And I thought, oh, let me check actually and see if this stays consistent, you know. And so I walked down the road a bit and I came back and I was like, oh, it actually is consistent. And so it was like, you know, it was a very majestic place, but it wasn't like some place that I couldn't have seen on planet Earth, you know. So,
right.
So it's been things that have been like traveling far distances, or presumably far distances, or like, you know, being able to jump into my door and go a place, but never like what's normally thought of as the astral plane, with all the like clouds and iridescent stuff and all kinds of magical stuff.
Yeah, all the different multiple levels that people talk about. I have yet to see a lot of that.
Yeah, same. Yeah, for me, I'm really hoping that here in the next, you know, couple months, that I can start gaining more traction with my astral projection practice, because for me, for a long time, I guess I had kind of like put it on the back burner and sort of treated it like it was not super important. But for me, I find that like it's something that I really do crave to do, you know, and I want to be able to develop further, you know, so that I can actually go and do more things, because it's never, even when I have like scary experience, it's never feeling like, oh, this was a wasted experience, or, you know, feeling like, oh, I always like having had it, even if during the time it was scary, because I feel like it's almost like a privilege to be able to experience all of these things that most people may not be able to experience in their whole life, you know. So it's, you know, it's really interesting.